Welcome back to another episode of EDPS Talk, where we dive into unique perspective on data protection and privacy with leading voices from all around the world and how this shape their respective files. Let me introduce you our distinguished guest today, who is well known for innovative approach to addressing topics such as artificial intelligence, online privacy, online harassment, or data usage. Welcome, Caroline Sinders.
Hi, thank
Caroline,
you so much for having me.
thank you. Caroline, you are a renowned researcher, artist, and designer known for your groundbreaking work at the intersection of art, human rights, and technology. Over the years, you have explored the dynamic interaction between technology, society, and human behavior. As founder of Convocation Design Research, you have developed initiatives using machine learning and user research to address communication challenges and advocate for the public good. Thank you, Caroline, for joining us and welcome.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, we usually start the interview with a personal question. So, can you tell us more about what does privacy mean to you?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's such an important question. For me, I do think of privacy as a fundamental human right. And it's something I've seen across the over a decade of work I've been doing related to online harassment. Meaning, as I've worked with victims, as I've done sort of large scale qualitative and quantitative studies, as my lab has really ramped up a rapid response program, we've really seen how a lack of privacy as it's manifested inside of technology really does have these massive implications on different users, particularly those that are facing online gender-based violence and tech facilitated violence. Now, having pro privacy and design is not a panacea, but it is incredibly helpful. It would solve a lot of the issues we're seeing, at least with our clients who are facing all different kinds of threats, from intimate partner violence to, adversarial government censorship, really this sort of wide scale of harm. And this is really what sort of informs our perspective that privacy has to be considered a human right, but also has to be considered a fundamental part of software and hardware design inside of technology.
Privacy is a concept that often appears in your projects, particularly in your work on higher resolutions. In this immersive exhibition, you use interactive artworks, talks from international technology experts, but also hands-on workshops to explore topics such as widespread surveillance, online privacy, but also the implications of artificial intelligence. So, in your opinion, regarding also your experience, how does artificial intelligence shapes human relationships, and how can emerging technologies also become a threat to human rights?
Yes, thank you so much for that question as well. I mean, there's so much to sort of talk about and unpack there. One of the things I would say is that, artificial intelligence is used in so many different aspects of a consumer's daily life, from perhaps how they get to, like, from their home to work, if they're using maps, if they're using certain kinds of train systems, like those systems might be using machine learning models to help program the trains, to how someone is sort of using a banking app, to, if they're using really any kind of very large online platform, in terms of social media for recommendation algorithms, to how they're just using something like Google search, right? So really, so many parts of a consumer's day has artificial intelligence within it, even if it's not necessarily obvious to the consumer. So one of the reasons our project with Hyphen Labs, higher resolutions at the Tate Exchange inside the Tate Modern, focused on privacy and focused on AI, was a sort of obfuscation of how AI really is inside of so many different kinds of consumer products, and how that can have privacy implications. One of the ways in which it can have privacy implications is if we just look at like a small slice of one of the things we described, let's say recommendation algorithms, right, inside of very large online platforms. consumers might not be completely aware of all the different kinds of data that's gathered about them. They might be aware of things that they feel like they obviously give a platform, like their name or their email, like how they signed up. If they're like following certain accounts or like if they are writing a post, right? Those are things in which consumers feel very like active about, or at least things that they can reflect on. What consumers often have less knowledge about is all the other kinds of data that's gathered about them when they're sort of engaging with very large online platforms. So that can be information purchased about them from data brokers. That can be how long they linger on a piece of content. That can be inferences about the community they're in. So people that they're following, people that they're not following, a sort of network built about them, right? Of how they're sort of using that platform. And then where they go off the platform, right? So if they go from the platform to, let's say, a Zalando, right, or a shopping website, and then they're going somewhere else, they're not aware that all of that is different kinds of data that's sort of feeding into this digital footprint about them, right, on that platform. And that's one of, I think, the really big privacy implications is that consumers are not aware. And so there's not a lot of transparency in terms of how the platform sees them, and also not a lot of consent in terms of what kinds of data they would like sort of built into a model or built into a platform, right, about them. A lot of those inferences that a very large online platform could be building about an individual could be wrong. It could be things that put that individual in harm's way. Let's say someone's living in a situation in which their sexuality is not recognized, or they're living in a situation in which their family, let's say, doesn't know that they're queer. That could cause danger to the individual, right? And so then if there is this sort of information and footprint that's sort of building up um, this sort of identity about them that they haven't been able to consent to, or they have sort of no control over, you can see how this has these sort of downstream effects. One of the things we see a lot at Convocation is in a lot of circumstances, with things like location services being turned on, of different recommendation algorithms sort of building sort of footprint of an individual's day, of their habits, that these can have these very direct impacts to a victim of effectively aiding in their doxing by their harasser. And this is incredibly problematic, as then a lot of victims can't really regain safety very well. They aren't sure how to sort of navigate the system to be able to create safety from the digital tools that they're using.
Yeah, indeed, we need to help people by giving them information to understand better how their data are processed. It's really interesting to know your opinion about the relationship between humans and technology. And so, in your opinion, do you think then it's possible to promote a human rights-centered approach to the development and application of AI, and at the same time stimulate innovation and technological progress?
I mean, I'd like to say yes, as that is like a big bulk of my work. So I kind of I have to believe that it's possible, right? If I'm going to continue to do the work that I'm doing. But one of the things I always really like to point out is that regulation does not stem innovation. I have a very long history of being a design researcher and UX designer. I've worked with many different big tech companies before I came over to the human rights side. And I actually think regulations, or even let's say like constraints, are also what supports innovation. Part of what I love about being a designer is sort of knowing what our design problem is. So give me a really thorny, or as we call like a wicked design problem in the design world, and that really kind of gets my brain going. So one of the things I always like to point out is, as technologists and as designers, we are trained to handle incredibly complex problems that have all different kinds of externalities. So I always get a little annoyed when I hear big tech companies say, or just companies in general, regulation will stem innovation. That's not true, and that's not a part of our training. In fact, as designers and technologists, we are trained to take the thorniest of problems and find solutions to them. That's the purpose of being a good designer, of being a good product manager, of being a good product engineer. If you can't handle a constraint, then that is perhaps that means that you have perhaps a weak design team or a weak engineering team, right?
Mhm.
But one of the things also I think is incredibly important to consider is all all technology innovation at some point does brush up against regulation. That doesn't slow it down. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem. If we look at the history of how, let's say, cars were developed, for example, when cars were first made, we didn't have things like stoplights, we didn't have airbags, we didn't have seat belts, right? We didn't have a lot of rules around how to drive. We had to make all of those things with the innovation. Did that limit the innovation of the auto industry? I would argue no. It helped it normalize into a consumer product, right? So I think for me, there is actually a lot of hope with regulation of if we're very serious about having AI continue to be embedded in consumer products, which I am actually pro that. There are a lot of things I like about artificial intelligence and machine learning. I think that there's a lot of benefits to having consumer facing products and products for consumers that have AI within them. If we're going to really actually innovate, if we're going to really make products for people, if we're really actually caring about consumers and their safety and their well-being, then regulation does not stymie innovation. I think it actually inspires it. So I often really push back against that question again because if we're going to make better products for people, regulation is a part of that. And that is a part of the design process, then. That becomes a key necessary part of creating tech innovation.
Your expertise offer really balanced perspective of the growing impact of artificial intelligence and, in more general way, digital tools on the contemporary artistic creation. And it's also linked to my next question, because according to you, what extent AI enrich or restrict artistic expression with potential consequences on the freedom of expression?
Right. So I am sort of two minds when it comes to technology and artistic creation. I was originally trained as a photographer, and I always like to give this example, which is when photography was invented, it was greeted by painters and illustrators as sort of destroying the creative world, right? Photography was seen purely as a technology and it was going to disrupt or ruin art. Now we can see, 200 plus years later that that's not true, that photography is an artistic method. It's enriched the art world. If anything, I would argue that the creation of photography helped push us into modern and contemporary aspects of painting. It's what helped give us cubism, for example. It's what helped give us surrealism. Those are incredibly foundational and important, right, artistic movements that are really rooted also around painting and sculpture. So one of the things I will say as an artist is I'm very, again, open to innovation. I think it's important when we're talking about artificial intelligence to sort of create maybe a separation between two topics. Generative AI, as we see it currently with like products like DALL-E or ChatGPT, and then what I call AI-enabled art. And I think it's important to separate these because, for example, I make data sets out of images. A lot of artists do this, such as my collaborator, who's a pioneer in this space, Anna Riddler, where artists will make or assemble their own data sets. They will then make and train their own models, right? And so in some cases, you're creating, again, a generative adversarial neural network. I think of that as AI enabled art. You are involved in almost every step of that AI process. You know the data that's going in, you had a hand in shaping that model, you can see what's coming out, and you can like go back and like reshape and remake things. It's a very involved process, right? So that is what I consider AI enabled art. And I think it's important to then separate those two spaces. The current way we see generative AI and AI enabled art. This is to say that I will not sort of, this isn't to say that generative AI, you can't make art out of it, but rather I think that there's a lot of issues in how a lot of companies have currently made generative AI, which impedes upon, I would argue, the agency and copyright of artists. There was a big movement, especially in the U.S., when there was recent sort of Hollywood protests, right? The Screen Actors Guild, the Writers Guild of America, IATSE, that's the technical theater union, and there was this amazing sort of tagline that came out of this, which was consent, credit, and compensation, right? So, and I think that that is actually directly related to how we think of artistic product. As a photographer, when I take images, I'm very aware of the copyright that I'm putting onto my images when they go into my art. Some of my artwork is open source, some of my artwork is not. But I'm very clear about how I want to be credited, right? And I would like to have a system in which I can consent to my images being a part of, let's say, a larger data set, right? So consent, credit, and compensation. If you're going to use my artwork, why not use it in a similar vein that a photo agency would, where I'm uploading an image. There are like image usage rights you have to opt into. There's payment, there's credit, and I can consent into like who is engaging with that image. Now I'm giving just one example really rooted in photography. That's a very normalized example in the photography world. We have photo agencies. There are a lot of things set up in this way. I think it gets more complicated when we start to look at things around, let's say, like open source images. So if I'm putting a lot of images, let's say on Flickr or like Wikimedia Commons, I know that I'm sharing it under a certain kind of like fair use license. But I'm sharing it thinking about maybe how people are going to use it, let's say in essays or in news media. One of the big wrinkles is then am I like sharing it to be used inside of something like machine learning? And the reason I think this is a wrinkle, and I will say that I'm not a lawyer, so I know this is a very contentious area inside of copyright law, but I think that there's something to think about within that of is what do we sort of mean when we're talking about fair use? Or what do we sort of mean when we're sort of saying like, yes, I want other people to use this? How can we maybe rethink consent mechanisms maybe on some of those platforms to say, I'm actually fine with someone using this in a certain aspect, but I'm not fine with it being used inside of a machine learning model. And there's many reasons for that. And one of the examples I'm thinking of is a lot of large companies will have a nonprofit arm that's like a research arm. So if I'm consenting to the image being used inside of, let's say, a research model, right? And so it's used for research, I personally am generally fine with that.
Mhm.
Where it gets complicated is what happens when that model, which is, let's say now is open source and used, was created via a research entity like a nonprofit, a think tank, a university, is then folded into a commercial entity. Now, I'm not okay with that, right? That's not what my copyright was. But the model is then different from my image, right?
Mhm.
And so, but my image was incorporated inside of the model. And I think this is one of the issues where I'm not totally sure how to square that circle, but I think that that's something, or at least for me as a creator and someone who thinks very deeply about policy, AI, and privacy, how do we sort of combat those two? Because that's the reality now of folks that are who are either open source artists or who care very deeply about open source knowledge creation, that contributing, let's say, to an open source art project where you want it to be used in non-commercial spaces or with non-commercial entities is a very real choice you've made. And now that's sort of getting obfuscated the longer we sort of go down the machine learning pipeline. Just to say, I don't have an answer, but this is one of the things that I think is a problem that gets really muddied with AI. It is, again, also, if we go back to a previous answer, this is one of those wicked design problems. This is one of those wicked problems that we have to sort of grapple with and deal with.
Thank you for pointing us the different way that we can use AI, and also all this copyright perspective were really interesting. And if we go even deeper, could you describe then the main ethical arising from the use of AI in artistic productions?
Yeah. Again, I think this is where it's really important to separate AI enabled art and generative AI, right? Because I would say with AI enabled art, we're talking about a much smaller scale system. Again, the artist is, very involved in the process. That process is actually much easier, I would argue, to be able to sort of check things like copyright, to check fair use, to really sort of make sure you're checking all the right boxes to sort of make the art piece, right? So if you are making, let's say, you're collecting different songs to then build like an audio model, it's there's a much easier pipeline of sort of being of the artist, or let's say the gallery or the museum or institution, actually being able to check, can we use these songs? How can we use them? How can we license them? And a lot of it's also easier to ensure that that's happening because we're talking about the sort of much smaller scale. And I'm thinking of an artist who I was working with, who was using popular media, and part of installing their work took quite a few months longer because we had to individually go through and check and make sure we could use those songs in the artistic installation, right? And so, but a part of that is if you're working with a cultural institution, you have to go through and do those things. You have to actually go through and do those checks. You're working on a smaller scale. So for me, when I think of new media art or tech art or AI enabled art, there isn't so much of an ethical quandary. Technology becomes just like a different kind of paintbrush in all of the paintbrushes that you're using metaphorically. I think it gets more complicated when we look at generative AI. And the reason, again, it gets more complicated is we have these issues of consent, credit, and compensation, right? So most likely people's copyright is being violated. These sort of these large scale systems are almost too large to really ensure. So as an individual, the onus is on me to go through and try to check. There often aren't clear ways for me to check if my image is inside of one of these systems, right? And so then there's not a lot of things at my disposal unless I'm willing to sort of engage with a lawyer, or I'm willing to engage with different organizations that are designed to help artists protect their copyright. Here in the UK, we're very lucky to have a group called DAX, where that is what they're like, that is how they exist. That's what they do. They work with artists to help artists understand their copyright, to help sort of exist or push for like their own ownership, right? But not all countries have that, not all cities have that. And I think this is sort of one of the bigger ethical considerations, again, is there's most likely a lot of copyrighted material inside of generative AI systems, inside of models that artists did not consent to, and that they actually have their copyright of, and they are owed at least credit or compensation for that usage, right? And I think that is one of the more ethical concerns. I will pause and say that, like, I am not anti-generative AI. I think that there can be a world in which we've made like ethical generative AI. It just might not look like current generative AI. For me as an artist, I find that very interesting though. What would it look like if there was a model, almost like a cooperative model or an opt-in model? What does that look like? Could that be a new frontier of knowledge exchange and knowledge transfer? Again, I come from the open source world where it's very normal to have people sort of volunteering to build something together, right? So what actually could this ethical space of generative AI look like that is made by a group of volunteers who want to contribute to that together? I think that's actually a very deeply exciting and interesting question to posit, to also see what does that look like. It won't look like Dolly, and it's not going to look like Midjourney, and it's probably not going to sound like ChatGPT. But I think that that's okay. And I think it would be sort of made better because it's made by people actively wanting to build it. And it's made by the commons and not made in a space in which a handful of people or a few hundred people are making a lot of decisions that impact thousands and thousands of people.
Yeah, copyright can be a really complicated topic, and that can be really interesting for artists to have, like in UK, expert to help them to go through all these questions. We saw that your research and your artistic practice really do offer an insight into the relationship between AI and artistic creation. Indeed, one of your research, called the Feminist Dataset, is a project that uses intersectional feminism as critical framework for investigating and critiquing machine learning. Can you tell us more about the concept and what are the key findings of the project?
Yeah, so thank you so much for asking about Feminist Dataset. It's one of my longest running projects. And one of the things I will say is it's very probably similar to some of the questions we've been sort of talking a little bit about. And I do sort of want to make a highlight, as while a lot of my work touches on copyright, it's not necessarily totally about copyright. A lot of it is also dealing with consent mechanisms in terms of, let's say, design, which obviously has copyright implications. But I think it's actually important when we talk, like if we're putting on a purely academic hat or a purely artistic hat, I'm thinking of consent as a mechanism towards technology building and also as a mechanism towards how contributors understand what they're contributing to inside of a participatory setting. So Feminist Data Set uses intersectional feminism as a framework for rethinking how to engage with every step of the machine learning pipeline. Part of the project is actually directly about friction and failure. Can you have feminist AI? If you have intersectional values, what does it look like to actually then try to make a model? How do you sort of operationalize doing that? The reason I say it's about friction and failure is that it's very hard to then take a framework and put it into reality, right? So saying like, oh, we're going to have, it's going to be purely participatory, that requires a lot of work. What does participatory mean in this situation or setting? It means often that some folks are more involved and other contributors are less involved. So then you have occasionally more contributors or a handful of contributors sort of driving an idea, even if you have, let's say, 1,000 people contributing, because those are putting in more time or like more involved in the project. So part of feminist data says, how do you reconcile that? And is that intersectional enough? So it's a critical design art project. It's a research project that's trying to look at how mechanisms and structures impact how we make software. Part of that is also thinking about how do you collect data sort of meaningfully. It's very inspired by my time. I used to work at the Wikimedia Foundation on the anti-harassment team. So a lot of this has been inspired by like my time in terms of working in open source and working in the public commons. So we hold a lot of workshops in which people contribute data that is text data, and the goal is that the text has to manifest intersectionality. So that's either what the text is about and how it's written. It's kind of the opposite of how data is collected in AI because it's very slow. So instead of aiming for a lot of data, our goal at the end of a workshop is just for people to contribute a piece of something that can be an article or an essay. So it's really kind of about slow data. And part of what I'm interested in is what does it look like to slow down the process of building with AI? Do we have more thoughtful data sets? Do we have, it allows for a much more slower but natural, organic, if you will, governance process, because I'm then vetting all of the pieces of text that are submitted, and I'm able to do that in a way that's very scalable, because this is like there's only a few of us that work on feminist data sets, mainly me at the moment. And so part of this is also thinking about how do you have different kinds of assurances in terms of what data is being submitted or not. In a lot of cases, I'll then go out and buy the piece of text that's been submitted, if it's a book, if it's an essay, if it's something that's behind a certain paywall. I'm going and purchasing that individual text so I can also use it inside the data set, which again functions a little bit more as an archive. The part of this is sort of grappling with very basic things of data governance, data provenance, consent and transparency. Another way we deal with sort of consent and transparency is we ask folks if they want to be listed as contributors, and then we often grapple with, if the author of the piece is still alive, how do we involve them in this consent process? And we haven't totally answered that, to be honest. So if we had, let's say, like more funding and a larger team, we would then be actively reaching out to every person whose work has been submitted and saying, in this workshop, someone submitted this piece of yours, like we have purchased a version of it. Are you still even okay with it being put into the data set, right? So it's sort of going this extra mile of consent, even though we've already purchased it. We want to make sure you're okay with it being included inside of this archive, inside of this data set. We don't have the capacity to do that, but that is a thing inside of our workshops we talk about. So we have to define consent in every workshop. Right now, our current workaround is it's listed, but anyone can remove their piece at any time. So if someone does contact us, we will remove it. That also means we have to actively list what is in our data set so people know what's there. So right now we're in the process of putting a snapshot, or well, not putting a snapshot, putting a list of what's in the data set online so people can search through it, but not necessarily download the data set because there's a lot of material in there that is not open source.
Mhm.
So a lot of this has sort of been a very interesting playground, if you will, a very interesting sandbox to be in, to work through some of these larger scale questions we're having inside of civil society around what is participatory AI? What does participatory data governance look like? What does data governance look like? How do you try to enact a consent or transparency model around an AI project? We're just sort of bringing it down to a much smaller scale.
Indeed, we can see that transparency and consent are really important values to you, and also that your profile is really at the crossroad of several fields, adopting sometimes different approach. Researcher can conduct empirical research, while artists can be more visionary and try to predict also the future on different factors. So, from both perspective and to finish, can you tell us more about how do you envisage the next 20 years?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it's such a really big and important question. I try to avoid either going too dystopian or too utopian, if you will. I try to sort of be in a much more middle space. Um, I think that we're in a really interesting turning point, where for artists in particular, for creatives, for makers, for those that are working in fields that in some cases we now see people sort of removing the professionalization of, if you will. So not recognizing like the deep skill it takes to be a graphic designer. I would argue a lot of that is popping up because of generative AI. I think that there are going to be a tough few years that happen, right, across the next few years, especially for younger creatives, for those that are just interesting or just entering different fields. Because I think there's going to be this over reliance on generative AI to try to fill in those gaps. I will say, as someone who works in art, who works in human rights, who also works in design, that generative AI is a poor substitute for working with someone. There's like a whole wealth of knowledge and context that has to go into problem solving. A large part of dealing with, let's say, creative clients is hearing them say one thing and realize they want another thing, which computers don't do very well. So I do think that we're going to have this very difficult few years for all different kinds of creative industries. A lot of those things are not necessarily caused by generative AI, but exacerbated, I would argue, by generative AI. They're caused by a lack of protections for creatives. They're caused by pushes by like larger companies to produce more and produce more. I'm thinking specifically about how film and TV function with special effects artists, where they're really put into what's called like crunch time. Same with game developers, right? Generative AI, I think, is going to exacerbate those pre-existing poor labor situations. And that's just one example. Another example is thinking about how we price or pay for art or commission art. Artists are paid not very well to make art. I think art is a very key fundamental part of society. So I think we're going to see some of that sort of continue. I'm hopeful of there being a course correction. I do think that there has to be regulation that comes out very explicitly addressing generative AI. Not to be overly hopeful, but as someone who was living in the EU and now lives in the UK, this is where, even though I'm an American, I look more towards Europe to really sort of leading and creating those pathways of safety with AI specific regulation. So for me, that's always sort of the hopeful space and point, is that we know that there's a problem. We know that perhaps there are ways to respond to that, either with forthcoming regulation or creating like new kinds of regulatory responses, or at the very least, trying to again leverage what we currently have to then better understand these systems to ensure that they are compliant with, again, pre-existing regulation. So for me, that is always a space of hope. I was very inspired by, again, the Hollywood actor strike that then involved the writer strike and also involved the technical theater and the technical staff of film and TV. That to me was deeply, deeply inspiring, of a group of like a specific creative class coming together, recognizing how AI and also their specific industry was mistreating them as workers. So I hope we see more of that, especially in Europe, where there are more, let's say, like more arts focused unions, or also just more protections for creatives. I still have also a lot of hope in terms of what AI can do that's beneficial for society. I haven't really allowed myself the space to dream about the next 20 years, because it feels like there's so many more immediate things to focus on right now. But I still have some hope that there are interesting ways in which that we can foster, again, consent, agency, and transparency for users to make safer versions of consumer facing software that are using artificial intelligence that also benefit the consumer. Um, but I don't know, perhaps that might be naive, but that is like, again, the guiding star of my work.
No, I think it's good to have hope also. Your ability to navigate across the world of research and artistic creation offer a really rich and nuanced perspective on the challenges and the opportunity that await us in the field of technology and privacy. Even if this conversation could go on for hours, we are almost at the end of this talk. It was really an honor of having you today, Caroline, and thank you for shedding light on the complex relationship between artificial intelligence and humanity and its growing influence in the fight of art. Thank
Yeah,
you
thanks.
also. Thank you. Thank you also to our listener for watching this special episode of the EDPS 20 Talks series. My name is Estelle Burgo, and please don't forget to watch our next and previous episode. And in the meantime, follow the EDPS on our channel to discover more about our initiative marking the 20th anniversary of the European Data Protection Supervisor. See you in next talk.